very much my pleasure to be here at UC Irvine. I definitely want to thank the Department of Global and International Studies for having me here today. And of course, for all of you, giving your full attention at what I assume is a very lovely 5 p.m. hour where most of us want to just fall asleep. But thankfully you're here instead. And particularly here to talk about what I think are pretty important dynamics. And to give you a sense, first of all, about who I am and what I do, I am a political geographer of a number of different topics of interest, specifically race, migration, social reproduction, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, welfare, and social movements. And I've been driven by these interests for some time, most of my life, including well before I became involved in academia. As Philip had just noted here, I've had extensive histories with writing about social movements and participating in them. Much of that started around the same time as all of you are right now in terms of age. And I decided to pursue that further in academia with a particular focus on the Asian diaspora. And that's very broadly phrased. But I want to narrow it down to roughly about the last 50 to 60 years, especially those elements of the Asian diaspora that don't get talked about as much, I would say. Those are considered vulnerable or somewhat outside the realm of labor production. Now, typically when we think about migrants or migration, we focus on people arriving into a country to seek out work, typically because they have trouble finding it in their countries of origin. And that's certainly true with how we talk about, say, Asian migration into the US or into Europe or Australia. We talk about a number of people sort of arriving, typically with their families, and choosing to find some kind of labor to make ends meet and to potentially succeed. What's interesting, though, is that this has led to a significant diversification and fracturing, I would say, of the Asian population in the US's case since roughly 1950s, 60s. This chart that you see up here is provided by AAPI data. It illustrates that for actually most of this last century, the sending country for most immigrants from Asia was mostly China and Japan. Nowadays, that's very rare. And what accounts then for this new subset of people? Well, that's what I try and explore in my ongoing work. I'm trying to understand this new contingent of the Asian diaspora, why they're arriving, how they are living, especially in terms of the realms of social reproduction, of welfare, how they manage things like their healthcare and education. All of those dynamics are of interest to me. I try and explore that from a geographical approach through a larger project called Asian America People's Atlas. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you want to know more. Now, some context. I focus specifically on two elements of that diaspora: transnational adoptees, that is children who, or infants who arrive into this country and then brought into a family that adopts them, and refugees. As you can see in this chart up here, which is compiled by data from the federal government as well as a variety of other sources, there's been enormous growth in adoptions from a certain period of time, starting roughly about the late 1980s and reaching its peak roughly about 10 to 15 years ago. You see also there's a steep decline in that. We'll talk about that more. And it's kind of hard to tell from this chart, but these light blue sections of the graph are all those that came from Korea, which for a long time, as you'll see, was one of the predominant senders of children to the US. And then later we see larger countries coming into the fore, including Russia, China, and Guatemala. But if you want to divide this up by continent, that is how much of each share these continents are sending children, Asia easily constitutes the majority of them, even to this day, right? So that's a real phenomenon. We're talking about tens of thousands of children arriving to this country through the purposes of adoption. We don't talk about it as much as a contingent of the Asian diaspora, and I'm trying to understand why that is and what are the reasons and the dynamics behind their position in this entire question in politics around migration in this country. The other dynamic is probably a bit better well known, especially in today's context, which is the arrival of refugees. And this is a global phenomenon. This chart illustrates the number of global refugees that have had to flee their country to a number of places. And as you can see, this number has skyrocketed very recently. But you'll also notice from this chart that even up until 1970s, even 1980s, those numbers were fairly minimal. We had certain dramatic spurts. This chart right here shows the moment when there were a large number of refugees leaving Southeast Asia. But starting roughly 1980s, 1990s, we see a relatively steady normalization of refugee flows, to the point now where this is actually becoming quite commonplace worldwide. And what's more, this has had a real impact on the Asian diaspora in the US. Much of those refugees that come from Asia came from Southeast Asia, particularly Hmong, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian. And as this other chart by API data suggests or shows, those poverty rates among that subset of Asian Americans is substantially higher than, say, Asian Americans as a whole. It's not discussed much because here in the US we have a sort of model minority discourse that circulates around Asian Americans. So I'm trying to understand both of those dynamics that seem to jar or not fit as snugly with the ways we talk about Asian Americans today. What's more, it seems important to me now because both of those trends, in adoption as well as in refugee migration, are dramatically declining. This chart on the left, provided by the Washington Post, illustrates the proposed refugee caps that keep dropping, actually, even as the demand and need for accepting more refugees keeps climbing worldwide. Even adoptions have dramatically decreased, in some cases because countries have just ended those programs entirely. Guatemala has ended theirs, Russia has ended theirs, China is scaling down their program in part because now they have a policy where you can have more than one child as a family. And Korea has also virtually eliminated theirs for other reasons I can get into later. But this is clearly also tied towards questions of the welfare of refugees and of adoptees as well. Not long after our current president came to power, he was already circulating proposals for changing dramatically all kinds of laws and policies around migration. And a big one was to do everything he could to ensure that refugees could not have access to basic welfare benefits. That not only includes public assistance monies, but even other valuable social services that most of us would need if we were struggling. That dynamic has not changed. It does not seem to be changing anytime soon, and what's more, we see it replicated throughout Europe and other areas of the world. As for adoptees, there's a lot of reasons why we've seen such a sharp decline. But one thing that has become well known now is that while we assume that when adoption is successfully completed, that for the most part, everything works out okay, we now learn that that's not really the case. We especially tend to think that when a family adopts a child from abroad, that there will be no problems that we typically might associate with, say, fostering a child here in the US. The reality is that many of those children are coming with sometimes significant disabilities or histories of abuse or violence, and those parents feel panicked oftentimes when they don't know how to deal with those problems. It comes with a certain cloud of risk that they weren't anticipating. Reuters just a few years ago published a tremendous expose on a practice that many adoptive parents chose to do when once they received a child from abroad, typically from places in Africa, Russia, and Asia, and not knowing how to respond to those problems, instead of maybe doing the responsible thing by contacting their government, they instead looked online and sought if there were any other potential families that could take their kid for them. And many of them have done so. Sometimes some of these adoptees have jumped from family to family, sight unseen, completely unregulated and completely unmonitored. So the larger questions around, again, the welfare of these migrants, very different cases, refugees, adoptees, are clearly tied to our current political moment. There's overall just a general anxiety now around these two groups that I'm trying to get at the center of. And I focus my research into these two groups in an unusual state, which is Minnesota. I don't know how many of you have been to Minnesota. It's substantially different from here. But Minnesota is actually a great case study for trying to understand what happens with migrant welfare and how it's governed. Among other things, Minnesota has a very early and sustained history of developing welfare services. They set up some of the first child welfare boards to monitor adoption and foster care in the very early 1900s. They have since established a national reputation for their child welfare services, and they also have robust welfare and public assistance services in general. It's been well documented now that many people moved to Minnesota primarily so they could get better welfare benefits while they were there. And this also then means that there are generally unanticipated waves of people who've moved to Minnesota because of that favorable welfare environment, some within the US and some from outside of it. This includes a large number of African Americans during the Great Migration, transnational adoptees, primarily from Korea, and also refugees. In this case, not just from Southeast Asia, but the Horn of Africa, such as Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Americas. And you'll find this dynamic in certainly a number of places throughout the country. Minnesota is not unique. California, of course, has very large refugee populations. But Minnesota was not expecting this. If ever you've ever been to Minnesota, even now to this day, it is still one of the whitest states in the Union. And the reception to large numbers of people of color moving in has been quite chilling. Even our current president made a point of stopping there, even though people were wondering, why would you stop there? You can't win Minnesota. But there is an actual strong racist backlash against refugee migration into the state. So that's what I'm trying to focus on, and Minnesota as a case study of how did this happen, how did welfare change in response to migration. Particularly, I'm interested in this realm of civil society. Civil society in this case meaning all those domains that don't fit neatly within capital, that is the realm of markets and producers and laborers, or within the realm of the state. That is what we think of as sort of the official governing agents of any one nation. But civil society in this case includes all sorts of different organizations, institutions, cultures, groups of people. That includes social movements as well, that all have a place in our society in terms of organizing our way of life, organizing our values, organizing everything about how we choose to survive or how to change the world around us. And civil society actually plays a very large role in governing welfare, and particularly of migrants. So I'm wondering what impact, if any, does their participation in migrant welfare governance have on what's been well documented as the neoliberalization and revanchist erosion of the welfare state? Neoliberalization, by that I simply mean the fact that at this point now there's been a pretty severe shift in priorities by federal governments on how they treat welfare subjects, particularly by disinvestment, that is taking away money for basic programs of survival. And revanchism, by that, that's simply the French word for revenge. So a particularly vengeful reaction towards subjects of the state that are deemed undeserving or moochers off of the state in some way. And in this, I'm having to converse with a lot of different conversations that have struggled with these questions, I think, substantially. I won't go into them in great detail here. I'll say that for later in the talk. But some of the more notable ones include autonomous theory. Autonomous theory is basically this idea that the way that we think about the world and how it's organized and how it changes is actually driven primarily by our own self-direction, right? By our own choices that we make by ourselves and with other people. We have actually a prime mover kind of role in how the world works, and it's often the large institutions like states or markets that have to respond to us, particularly because we often resist being controlled in whatever kind of way. This particularly comes to a lot of Marxist kinds of readings and discussions. So I use this. I certainly also use conversations around race and biopolitics. Biopolitics, by this I simply mean how people engage in organizing populations and subjects in a way to kind of encourage their living. So there's a sort of power relationship whereby helping to nurture and encourage a life that allows a certain buy-in from populations as such. Recently, too, there's been a number of new developments that I think are quite exciting. One of those includes critical adoption studies. Even the notion of there being an adoption studies is quite remarkable because up until very recently, most people who studied adoption were specialists. People who work in adoption, like adoptive parents or adoption workers, social workers. But now we've had a number of people who've risen to kind of critique that. That includes many adoptees themselves who now are adults. And that also includes great work of many people, including here on this campus, Alina Kim in Anthropology, as well as Michelle Goodwin. Both of them have done a great job of trying to locate adoption and child welfare into kind of a critical nexus, try and frame it within dynamics of colonialism, imperialism, and the overall intersections of what happens with race and the state and capital. And finally, I would just say a critical ethnic studies approach to the sort of hidden transcripts a political struggle. And that phrase comes from James Scott, trying especially to understand how is it that we organize, especially in moments where it seems like there's no way to declare what that looks like, and that can't be read visibly. So much of the political work that interests particularly a lot of ethnic studies scholars, you can't find in archives, you can't find in records, you can't find declared anywhere. It won't have a sort of voice even on social media, but it still exists. You can tease it out through understanding culture, through understanding other kinds of discourses and communications. So all of these things I apply to try and understand this case study. And I do this by instead of reading civil society. I'm going into, this case, thousands of pages of archives located throughout the country and asking them, tell me, civil society, how you work, what you're thinking. Because civil society actors, that includes a number of different welfare agencies, state institutions, all of those, can be very upfront oftentimes about how they're thinking about all kinds of problems that come to their mind. They leave these in their memoranda, they leave these in their reports, they leave these in their meeting minutes, and you can read these in a critical way. Now there's some real danger to that too, because oftentimes what you find in the archives has its own power relationship behind it. Lisa Lowe does a great job in her own work, such as Intimacies of Four Continents, to say that we have to engage in the archive in a way that acknowledges that what the state or any institution puts forward for us to see comes out of a particular powerful decision. That is, what do we want to be seen? How do we want history to be remembered? And so that's a sort of a cautionary tale for how to engage in the archives, if those of you are interested in doing so. But typically, if you go through enough of them, including sort of people's archives, that includes documents that are just kept by people, maybe in basements or what have you. If you go through enough of them and corroborate together, you can eventually code for what comes up often and try and get a better sense of what is actually happening, what people are thinking. So that's what I try and do, and I try and corroborate that further by interviewing the people who are on the ground seeing this happen. Now I'll just note this right off the bat. It might not seem when we think, when we talk about adoptees or refugees, that there's a lot of politics or sort of political movements around them. Probably the most prominent things we can think of are, say, immigrant rights organizing. But the reality is that there is a whole bevy of politics, whole realms of struggle that are buried in those struggles, if you know where to look for them. And I try and unearth that here. I still have struggles with that, in part because I'm trying to name a politics that maybe people at the moment couldn't even name. I'll talk about that further on the talk. So what are some of the things I want you to take away from here today? I'm going to cover three main arguments. First of all, again, what are the impacts of civil society having this prominent role in migrant welfare governance? How does that change or contribute to or push back against what we know has been this ongoing deterioration of the welfare state, which we are living now today, right? We are seeing this massive disinvestment and punitive response towards welfare subjects. Well, one major impact that they have is they really help to expand how welfare is done in this country. It's very uneven expansion, and I would say quite torturous in the end. But that comes about because there's been far more invested actors that in a sense are filling this vacuum. Two cases here. So first, talking about adoption. If you happen to be adopted or know someone who has been adopted, and you ask them, what was the process like in terms of how you arrived in, say, a country or into a new family? Typically, they would say, well, there is some sort of process that was in place. There are policies that had to be followed, paperwork that had to be filled. Everyone had to be screened, both the adoptive parents and the child, in some cases, the child's birth parents. And then maybe after 6 months, a year, maybe more than 1 year, that gets smoothed over and then it's done. And that might suggest then that the actual number of actors that are involved, again, civil society actors, is quite limited. And that is true up until a certain point in time. It's been well documented that up until roughly the civil rights era, around 1960s, these general groups, three that I've listed up here, were the main ones that are dictating how adoption worked. They're the ones who decide how it gets governed. Adoption agencies, including welfare agencies of all kinds, both public, that is government-driven, and also voluntary. I'm going to use that word a lot, but voluntary simply means these are done by individuals outside of government, right? So they're involved, so are sort of independent facilitators. Those could include commercial outlets, that kind of thing, people who sell children for the market, and also monitors at the national and international level. And they kind of had a real plenary power. They got to decide how all of this worked. By the end of the civil rights era, and well up until today, the number of people who were involved in this, and this is just a very small sampling, has grown expansively. And as you might notice from this new listing of organizations on the right hand, they were driven by the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement, we typically don't ever associate that with things like child welfare. We typically associate that things with struggles around education, around elections, employment, those basic kinds of needs and rights. And those are essential. But there's been a long, ongoing current of organizing in the civil rights era, primarily led by mothers and women, primarily black and indigenous mothers and women, that wanted to center and did an effective job of centering the welfare of their children in that struggle as well. You don't hear about it too much today, but its impact has changed everything about how adoption works. We can talk about that more in the Q&A, but I'll just simply summarize by saying this was mostly a white women-dominated field. White women were the social workers, white women were organizing this entire arrangement. By the time all of this is done, many of those agencies and organizations suddenly have to set up a seat at the table for all these new insurgent groups. They include radicalized social workers. They include people who struggled for welfare rights. Welfare rights simply meaning we want to have a control in how we're given the services that we demand. We want more money than we're getting because we aren't getting enough while we're this poor in this country. It also includes a number of different advocates for indigenous peoples, for African Americans, people with disabilities, and so on. And it's not just them either. Out of this web comes about a number of new groups that may not have been as politicized, but no less powerful. For the first time, foster parents start to organize their own organizations. Adoptive parents do the same. Very unusual. You don't hear about this much anymore today. But during this time, they felt there's a space here. Something's been opened. There's a massive crisis in child welfare. We should have a say in all of this as well. And this eventually leads to the so-called children's rights movement and child advocacy organizations, many of which are very prominent to this day. This all emerges out of this one great moment. That's super confusing. I ended up researching this for years, and I still don't fully understand how it came about. But it's important to note, primarily because the result is far more expansion of not only how welfare is governed, but who all is involved in that, and the kind of tensions that emerge as a result. And this is not simply limited to adoption, but also to something that we think of as far more state-driven, which is, in this case, refugee processing. So there have been precedents of refugees arriving in the United States in large numbers that, in a sense, overwhelmed the new host government. We can include examples from Hungary, from Cuba, certainly 1960s. Perhaps the biggest moment where the federal government really felt the need to expand and change how they processed refugees was at the end of the Vietnam War in the 1970s. And they ended up forming a large number of committees at all levels, state, federal, international, working with all kinds of different groups, many of which were voluntary, sort of self-help kind of groups. And they set up a system that they thought would better process this large number of refugees. And they set up new policies too. One of the policies was that after learning from Cuba, where so many Cuban refugees ended up going to Florida, which is right nearby, one of the new policies was to say, all right, all these new refugees coming from Southeast Asia, we're going to make sure they're dispersed pretty much evenly throughout the country so that no one state is overwhelmed by these new arrivals. Didn't end up working out that way, but that was one of the new policies. In the end, they set up what they hoped was a very thorough system of how to process these new arrivals. This is from a report published by Hubert Humphrey when he was Attorney General of Minnesota in 1978. So this is not long after this happened. He formed an entire support system. And hopefully you can see that the way that they thought the system worked was at the very top you have primarily government levels, Department of Education, welfare, economic security. So they're doing some of the major processing of the new arrivals. You have advisory groups, voluntary agencies, the private sector. And finally, more localized centers. This includes programs that cover employment, ESL translation and training, different forms of welfare and literacy. And at the very bottom, these different self-help groups that were naturally, organically organized by the refugees themselves. So you might think from looking at this that this is a very well-organized system and that it all comes down from the top. The reality is this is not the case at all. So for my very thorough and still ongoing review of the records, what comes up over and over again is that that middle tier, the voluntary agencies in the private sector, suddenly become much more powerful as a result of this. Because at the very top, these departments really have no clue what happens. They get to process the actual arrivals, but in terms of how does a refugee resettle, assimilate, get adjusted to their new location, this is not their domain. They are literally clueless in many cases. You can read it in the meeting minutes. They are very much dependent on these voluntary agencies who have had massive experience to guide them, to offer the right policies, and to be flexible. It looks different in terms of where refugees arrive in Dallas, Texas, which had very few refugees, versus Minnesota, which had much more, and certainly California, which had a lot. And so, in a sense, they get to decide to a great extent how the policies work, right? And this is why it's so important when we think about welfare, especially migrant welfare, to not just focus on what the state does or thinks. Because oftentimes the state, in a sense, displacing that power onto other agents and other actors. So those are some consequences. Now, what ends up resulting as a result of, again, this large participation of voluntary actors, the private sector, all of them having much more power in both the realms of adoptee migration and refugee migration, is very unusual. Because over time, many of those same groups start to have a very strained relationship with the people they are saving. We have to understand that these groups were driven by strong humanitarian impulses after World War II to save as many families and especially children that were regarded as vulnerable and were not going to be cared for well throughout the rest of the world. And there's a strong ideological bent to this as well, namely the notion that we have to save people from godless communist areas of the world, places where we think that they're going to be mistreated very cruelly. And yet, over time, those same actors engaged in a really degrading form of class warfare directed against the very people that they save. One of these organizations I want to talk briefly about is one that I came across called OURS. OURS is short for Organization for United Response. If you note, Organization for United Response, when you develop the acronym for that, does not become OURS, it's a long story. But OURS was an adoptive parent group that was formed in Minnesota. It ended up becoming the largest parent group in the entire country. It became nationalized at some point. They had over 50,000 members. And they ended up putting out a lot of different materials, including this magazine cover, that basically nicely encapsulated their approach. Namely to think, it is our place, if we can, to save as many children as need saving, no matter where they are, whether here in the US or throughout the world. But let's be clear, once we do get them, they're ours, right? We're not going to be thinking about where they came from or their birth parents or birth family of origin, right? So a very proprietary relationship to the people that they save. So you might think, okay, well that all works out nicely, and yet there's a very strong anti-black racist bent to this kind of push, in part because of where many of the adoptees ended up. Now, it's sort of anecdotal, but many people have traced or noted that most of these adoptees who arrive from outside the country don't tend to locate themselves in the cities, right, where you'd find other people of color. Many of them grow up in suburbs or rural areas. Very anecdotal. We don't have good, solid evidence of that. But I was able to put together a kind of database to try and establish that more clearly. Turns out that for a time, back before there were real liability issues around sharing sensitive data, many of these same organizations were keeping track of where every single adoptee from anywhere in the country was arriving, in terms of their exact birth family, the city they were living in, how old the kids were, and so on. It's an incomplete record, but in the case of Minnesota, what I found were data points for roughly about 62% of all adoptee arrivals from Korea. Now, 60% is not 100%, but I'd say it's still very representative of a kind of database for understanding where do they end up and how might that shape their experience and the experience of their parents. Now, this is not from that. This is simply from the census data you can get easily at a local level. And it shows basically where all those identify as black in the census, where do they end up living. And this is roughly around the mid-1980s, sort of the peak of adoption into Minnesota. Unsurprisingly, for those who know their geography, right in this little area is Minneapolis-St. Paul, the largest urban area of the state. And it is by far where the highest concentration of African Americans ended up moving to. And you can imagine this holds true for most all communities of color, as is true for everywhere throughout the country. Most of them end up in urban areas. Compare this to what I found from looking at the Korean adoptee data. What jumps out for me looking at this is that for the most part, there was a very strong likelihood that if you grew up as a Korean adoptee in Minnesota in the 1980s, you will not find another person of color anywhere. Right? Not growing up, not in your schools, they won't become your friends. If anything, you're more likely to meet other adoptees from outside the country than you are to meet other people of color. And what does that fuel? Well, among other things, it means that many of these adoptive parents and adoptive families feel largely separate from and kind of indifferent towards the struggles of black Americans, which are quite prominent throughout this time period. And it's been well traced, especially in my own interviews with adoptive parents, that many of them strongly resisted any of the kind of work by many black mothers and black birth parents to push for greater rights for their children, or for children's rights in general. And they saw that, in a sense, as infringing not only on their own rights as adoptive parents, but as, in a sense, trying to claim that they deserved something, when for the most part, many of these white parents saw black families as the undeserving poor. They'd already, in a sense, entrenched that mode of thinking about welfare and how it should be governed between deserving and undeserving. And so they often used their own children as kind of weapons in that respect. You can see in their reports and the media that they circulated that they really felt that their main purpose was to save children, but in such a way as to absolutely destroy their families of origin. Right? And they often could see a clear line between saving children from Korea and how that was necessary for oftentimes destroying families in Minnesota, black families, indigenous families, who saw their children taken from them for all kinds of reasons during this time. Refugees, it was far more dramatic. There's a nice corollary here between both, in this case, the rise of enrollments in the largest welfare service at that time, aid to families with dependent children, doesn't exist anymore. This is on the left-hand side. The peak of it is right at the end of the 1960s. And then not long after, the rise of the Hmong refugee population in the Twin Cities, roughly around 1981, 1982. So these are large, very large expansions in number of people who live there, and also how many of them are enrolling in welfare programs. So it's a big cost to the state. The main difference, though, is that at its peak, at the end of the 1960s, roughly about 20% of African Americans in Minnesota were enrolled in those public assistance programs. That was alarming for the government at the time. So much so that they started really trying to cut and curtail those programs and limit access for people to attain them. But on the other hand, that number was 68% in the case of the Hmong. And it stayed that level for quite some time. And you better believe that these voluntary sectors, welfare organizations, adoptive parents themselves, many of whom helped resettle refugees, saw that as a problem. They were not sympathetic to the fact that many refugees struggled to get any source of income or any resources, but they saw that this is a real problem of welfare dependency. Now, many of you probably don't remember when that term was in vogue, but it was very much applied in this case to black mothers, indigenous mothers, during the 1980s and 1990s, one of the reasons why welfare was substantially reformed in 1996. There's a concern basically that if people used welfare for too long, they would be deterred from becoming economically independent. In a sense, becoming moochers off of the state, right? And so being thought of as undeserving poor. Well, that same kind of notion applied much more to the case of refugees. You can see well-supported reports, interviews, memoranda Well, this was such a concern that many of these voluntary agencies, those that actually helped resettle refugees, complained about this and saying, we should handle all of this. We should not work with all these different state departments. We should govern resettlement entirely so that we can do a case management, case-by-case basis with each family with the sole objective of deterring these refugees from accessing welfare. Right? That's what they had believed. That's what they felt would be the best solution to that problem. If anything, ironically, these state governments that already did not approve of this huge expansion in public assistance enrollment, they pushed back against that. They said, no, these people really are in need. We need to keep providing those services if they need them. But the very people that are saving these families are trying very hard in a sense to destroy their ability to survive through, again, a kind of alarmism that emerges in tandem with the welfare reform craze of the 1980s and 1990s. Finally, I'll just add this, namely that what all these efforts indicate, particularly around adoptees, refugees, or other sort of contingents of migrants, is a kind of vulnerability that we typically associate with indebtedness. When I say that, I'm drawing off of the work of Mimi T. Nguyen in her book, The Gift of Freedom, which is focused in this case on Southeast Asian refugees. And she says in this book that it's a paradox, or more accurately, it's a frustration, that for many refugees, they feel doubly indebted to the country that they go to. On one hand, that country often liberated them from their original country, but then when they arrive in the new country, they feel indebted once again because they're able to resettle and build a new life. And that relationship of debt isn't exactly benevolent, because she says that can never be repaid except by continually being docile subjects and, in a sense, going along with the machinations of a state or capital market, whatever it might be. And this is what she says is the position of many refugees, that they go in a sense, already knowing that they will always must be grateful, not accounting for the fact that perhaps the reasons why they had to leave was often because of the aggression or violence by the country that brought them in the case of the US and Vietnam. So that is a real struggle to push back against this notion of indebtment. But I argue that that actually keeps coming forward over and over again. I mentioned that in the case of Minnesota and the rest of the country, in the case of refugees, the US government arrived at a policy to disperse them everywhere so that there would no one concentration in one particular geographic region. And that initially proved to be the case. Even to this day, if any of you decide to go to Alaska or Louisiana, which I love, you can still find enclaves of Vietnamese Americans in places as far-fetched as Nome or New Orleans or Las Vegas. And you might ask yourself, why is that? Why would they go there? Well, the reality is that different welfare organizations, voluntary institutions, helped resettle them there with the anticipation that they would stay there. But that wasn't the case. Because the state can decide where people will initially go, but it can't decide where you go once you arrive. And it turns out many of those refugees realize, we're getting a raw deal here in Alaska, for example. We can go somewhere else with better welfare benefits and better protections and services. And so now, today, the majority of that Southeast Asian diaspora is located in just 3 states. One of them is this state, California. The other 2 are Minnesota and Wisconsin, of all places. Right? That's what we call secondary migration. And that ended up becoming a significant burden on those state governments. What does that suggest? Well, it's not too different from the kind of autonomy that was exerted by, say, Black Americans during the Great Migration. As long as they had the power to move and to choose where they would go, they would do it. And of course, to this day, we are still living the effects of that Great Migration, especially in an urban context. But we can see the same thing in terms of where migrants choose to go and how they choose to live. That often tends to refuse being subjected in the ways that governments or the private sector or civil society intends them to do. So to sort of summarize, I would say that there are 3 major takeaways. As civil society institutes and organizations have become involved, particularly the private sector, in governing migrants, for the most part, they've expanded and privatized what that looks like, especially in the wake of the fact that the state has relatively weak governing ability in those cases. So they fill a vacuum. In some ways, that's very messy in terms of the large number of institutions that can take up that space. But many of those same actors then mobilized for more punitive welfare reform strategies, in a sense punishing their very own subjects that they were tasked with saving. They entangled migrant welfare with the ongoing anti-Black indigenous revanchism that characterized what welfare reform looked like during that time. But at the same time, I would say that the unruly autonomy, that is the capacity for people to refuse to assimilate, to refuse that relation of debt, the feeling that they need to be grateful, the fact that they can keep crowding in on services. You crowd in on a place like Minnesota and Wisconsin, which doesn't expect you, to in a sense push that welfare state to respond in a way that will listen to you, or simply to hustle for whatever resources that you can get. This continues to undermine the planned biopolitical networks of control, the ways that we expect people would want to live and choose to live based on their social reproductive realms. This has many consequences. I would say the main consequence today is that recognition of the fact that migrant subjects of all kinds have really taxed existing welfare services and have also at the same time fueled more evangelism directed against them is part of a pattern that we see to the current administration. So really, his proposed policies of cutting refugees or other migrants off of welfare entirely should not be surprising, because this has been in place for some time now. And the fact that we might think it is surprising because it's associated with people that we don't normally think of as being welfare dependent should not be. So I just want to point quickly to the next steps I'm taking and the hard questions I'm still working through. I want to expand this work going forward to interviews and collaborations with refugee organizations and organizers, especially those who are active in welfare. There are still to this day welfare rights organizations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, California, everywhere. And many of them now have refugees who are active participants. Some of them have been around since the 1970s and 80s. So this is a valuable source of data, and it's a valuable source of knowledge in terms of what they've seen and how they strategized around the domain of welfare. But I'm still wondering about the value of a less visible kind of movement politics for migrants. It's one thing to say that migrants or refugees or adoptees are organizing an actual social movement around social reproduction. It's another thing to say that they are all, say, moving to Minnesota to gain access to welfare benefits. How do we read that domain of social reproduction? It's far easier to read organizing in the realm of labor or identity kinds of politics we see a lot today, but probably not as obvious when it comes to welfare. Let's be honest. People still feel a lot of shame around accessing welfare services and organizing to get those services, but they're often a critical part of how we choose to live and how we reproduce ourselves. So how to interpret those hidden transcripts, especially in the wake of the fact that despite all of that activity, state violence directed against these migrants and dispossession of them actually seems to be ramping up in a way that has no limit at this point. I still struggle with this quite a bit. It challenges my understandings of autonomy, it challenges my understandings of what could be politically possible in the case for those who are very vulnerable and subjected to an ongoing violence from the moment they arrive in this country. But hopefully I can keep working through it, and hopefully all of you can help me think through it too. So I'll just close by acknowledging the many people who've made this possible, including the people who worked at the archives that I've gone to see, the people I've interviewed, including adoptive parents. The grant that was provided by Spelman College, my institution, and finally, of course, Philip, Eve, Jessica, Jewel, Yusuf, Department of Global and International Studies here. Appreciate getting to be here. Thank you so much.